The new feature in JavaScript that everyone is talking about lately, async await. In this video, we're going to learn what all the hype is about. To get started, you must first know that async await is part of ES8 and is built on top of promises. If you aren't sure what promises are, make sure you check out that video first. Now, underneath the hood, an async function is a function that returns a promise. But the benefit of async await is that it makes code easier to read. Let me show you what I mean. This is a promise that we just made up. It's a move player function. Imagine we're designing a game and it has the distance plus the direction that the player moves. And if we want to chain these, we have move player dot then move player again, move player again, move player again. Now, this is asynchronous code. We know that move player is going to happen, then this is going to happen, then this, then this. If we want to have any sort of action within here, we can wrap it in brackets and console log, add extra actions, all things that you can do with promises. With async await, it would look something like this. What's going on here? The big benefit of async await is that it makes code easier to read. And I know you're probably not thinking that right now because this is new syntax, but just give it a chance. The goal with async await is to make code look synchronous. A code that's asynchronous look synchronous. Now, if you remember, a promise in JavaScript is kind of like an IOU. I promise to return something to you in the future. Something like an AJAX call, resizing an image, getting some information from a database. These are all things that take time. Instead of waiting around on them, we want to continue on with our lives and just have it let us know when it's done. But we're going to keep working on our own stuff while it's doing that in the background. We do it this way because that is how JavaScript works. If you remember, in our How JavaScript Works video, we talked about JavaScript being single-threaded. For our programs to be efficient, we can use asynchronous programming to do these things. So promises help us solve this, and it looked like this. Now remember what I said at the beginning. Async await code are just promises underneath the hood. We call this syntactic sugar, something that still does the same thing, but is just different syntax to make it look prettier, syntactic sugar. And promises have this .then that you keep having to chain. Async, on the other hand, has this async word in front of it and some await keywords. So let's go through what all this means. Although these two things do the same, with the player start function, we first declare a function as async. We let JavaScript know, hey, this is an async function, and we declare it with the word function and then the function name. We now can do anything we want inside of this function, but we have access to a new word because we used the async word to define this function. We have the await keyword. And this keyword says, and we can remove this for now. This await keyword says, hey, pause this function until I have something for you. So we're awaiting the response. And you can use this await keyword in front of any function that returns a promise, which we know that move player does. And once the promise is resolved, then the function moves to the next line, and it awaits the next move, and awaits the next move, and awaits the next move. Now, the cool thing about this is that instead of chaining it like this, I can now assign, just like a synchronous programming, variable first to await this, and I can assign second to await this. And first and second will have the result of each function, but in a variable. So it looks very synchronous. You're not using .then, you're not chaining. You just have simple synchronous programming. You're waiting for this to happen, then waiting for this to happen. But let's use a more realistic example so we really understand this. If we use our fetch function, and again, if you remember, fetch function, that's a promise. You see that we get a promise. So with the fetch function, if we use our favorite API resource, JSON placeholder, let's grab the users here. So this user's endpoint, if we want to fetch something, we did return a promise, so we would do a .then response. We would have to run it through JSON, and then finally .then console.log the response or the data that we get. So again, if I copy and paste this into our console, get a promise that's pending initially, then it gets resolved, and I get my users. Now, how can we turn this into an async function? Again, the same feature, it'll work the same, but it will look a little bit cleaner. It will be syntactic sugar. Well, if you remember, we have to declare a function with async keyword, and this function will say fetch users. And fetch users will have this inside of it. But we can now use, in front of anything that returns a promise, the await keyword. So now this function is going to pause until we get a response from fetch. So I can say const response equals await the fetch call. And now, instead of using the .then, I can say const data equals await response.json, because again, response.json returns a promise, so I can put the await keyword. And then finally, I can just console.log data. All right, let's copy and paste this and see if it works. All right, now I call the fetch users function, which is the async function. Oh, and I made a bit of an error here. There's no response, it's short form response. There you go, let's try that again. So let's refresh that, copy and paste, run the fetch users function, and look at that. We have our promise that got resolved, and we have our users. Nothing different from the promise, but now we have a nice step-by-step synchronous looking code that says fetch this, get a response, then run it through the JSON method, and then console log data. And you might be thinking to yourself, is this actually prettier than what we had before? Let's remember what we had before. This is what we had before. This is what we have now. And some of you might argue that the first promise way looks better. And you know what? It's personal preference, and this is a simple example, so there are times where this actually looks a lot cleaner. But I'm a big believer in doing what's easiest to read and understand for you and your teammates. Let's do one last example. Let's do something even more realistic. Let's say that we have a list of URLs, and this time we have the users, the posts, and albums from the JSON placeholder API. And we want to run through them all. If you remember, in our promises video, we had something like this. Let's remove this so we can see it better. So we had something like this. We did promise.all, we mapped through the URLs, we fetched the URLs and responded with the JSON. And then we returned the array, and the array had users, posts, albums, and we also did a .catch. So again, just to make sure that this works, going to copy this, put it into our console, and we see that we get our users, posts, and albums data. So that's working. Let's convert this into an async function. Well, let's start by doing a const get data, and this will be an async function. And I want you to point out that I did it this time with function expression instead of the way that we did it last time, which was async function and then the function name. But I just want to show you both ways. All right, so how can we do a promise.all? Well, if you remember, we can now put the await keyword in front of any promise. So we can put the await keyword in front of promise.all. So I can say that const, and this is a little ES6 magic of destructuring. I can say users, posts, and albums that we're going to receive is going to equal await, and then the promise.all, which we already have. So let's just copy that. We're going to copy the promise.all and place it on here. All right, and now we can just console log what we had. We can copy and paste right after we await all the promises. We'll have users, posts, if I can spell, and then albums. And instead of array, because we've done it with destructuring, we can just say users, posts, and albums. All right, so let's see if this works. Copy and paste this and run get data. And look at that. We got the exact same results. Very cool. But there might be one thing that you noticed here. That is, in the promise way, we have the .catch. If any of these fail, we want to catch these errors. How can we do that with async await? Right now, we're not catching any of these errors. Well, this is the part that not a lot of people are big fans of, but it is something that once you get used to is not too bad. JavaScript has something called try catch blocks, and that is when it sees the try word, it's just going to automatically run whatever's inside of it. In our case, all of this block, we want it to run in a try block. And then try comes with a catch block as well. So try, catch block. And within the catch, if anything fails within here, well, we can catch it in here. So we can just do console.log. Oops. So now, let's say I misspelled one of the URLs. Let's copy this. Let's try it out. We'll have the new URLs. Let me clear that. New URLs with the misspelled URL for one of them. We're going to copy and paste the get data. And you'll see over here that we get a syntax error. And that is because one thing you have to remember with catch is that the catch receives an error. And this error, you can console log it if you want. So let's just console log and then try this again. This time we'll just call this one get data 1. Perfect. Now if I clean this up a bit and do get data 1 with the try catch block, I get, oops, type error failed to fetch. So I get the catch block with the error, just like we did with promise.all, just using promises. And there you have it. That's it. Async await, although intimidating at first because there is a bit of new syntax, actually makes things quite nice and synchronous looking. We simply have a variable that we assign the await promise to, and then the function pauses there until the promise returns, and then it continues on with console logging. And you just have to remember the try catch blocks here to catch your errors. And that's it. You're now an async await master. You can use whichever one you prefer. Like I said, at the end of the day, use promises or async await functions based on whichever one is simpler for you and your team. But hopefully, when you encounter both of these, you're now a lot more comfortable. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.